Hi, my name is Daisha and welcome back to Day-to-Day Dental. As of right now, I'm a pre-dental student applying in the 2023 to 2024 ADEA application cycle in hopes of beginning dental school in fall of 2024. Last summer, I began studying for my DAT in May of 2023 and then studied for a total of 10 weeks in the summer. At the end of July, I took the DAT and scored a 23 academic average, which is around the 92nd percentile, with a total science score of 22. Today, I'm going to be breaking down my DAT score and explain how I studied for and received a 23 to apply with for dental school. One week after graduation, I began studying for my DAT using the 90-day subscription from DAT Bootcamp. Because of a prior trip I had planned for that summer, I studied during the second week of May and then took 2 weeks off in May where I did not study at all for the DAT. After coming back from my trip, I studied for a total of 9 weeks for the remainder of the summer until I took my DAT at the end of July. I will talk about my study process more in depth in a future video, but I do want to note that I did not adhere to a strict schedule or calendar while studying for my DAT, as I found that it was just best for me to go with the flow and do what I needed to do every day in order to get the score that I did. Then at the end of July of 2023, I received a 23 academic average and a 22 total science score for my DAT. And now I will further break down my scores for each section of the test. Honestly, the sciences were a whirlwind for me. Despite being a biology major in college, I found that my background in the sciences were kind of iffy due to being a student in the pandemic, as well as just my strong suit not being sciences, in all honesty. I actually took cell biology in 1 month. I took a 16-day course over cell biology on Zoom during the pandemic. The course was scheduled over 4 weeks, where I had 4 days a week where I would meet for classes and then have 3 days on the weekend to kind of catch up on notes and do the best that I could. My biology professor explained that this course was going to be really difficult, but it was for the bio majors who weren't able to get into the semester-long biology courses available at my undergrad institution. Because I had started college as a chemistry major and ended up switching into biology, I was unable to take cell biology at the beginning of my time in college, so I had to take this 16-day course. While this course was very informative, and honestly my professor did the best job she could, I actually ended up getting a C+. There were 7 exams that I had to take over the course of those 16 days, and I had daily quizzes and labs on top of that, and it was all online, so it was just honestly a little bit of a mess, but I did learn a lot during that time and I did the best that I could. So I am glad that I took it, but it wasn't the most ideal situation. In the same way that I did in cell biology, I actually didn't do too well in my second general chemistry course either. During that semester, we ended up going home because it was 2020, and I found that it was really hard to study general chemistry in my bedroom. So I didn't do as well as I would like, and I ended up with a C+. So I actually ended up applying to dental school with 2 C+, both being in Gen Chem 2 and in cell biology. Because of that, I was pretty apprehensive about taking the DAT because I wasn't looking forward to the general chemistry portion, but I ended up doing a little bit better than I thought I would, and I'll explain that later. Lastly, I took both organic chemistries on Zoom, and I ended up taking them in fall of 2020 and spring of 2021, which were both held online. So I did not have lab in person, except for the last 4 weeks of organic chemistry 2, but I ended up doing a lot better than I thought I would. In the first organic chemistry, I received an A-, and in the second one, I received a B, which were both very hard fought for and I'm very proud of. So I was glad that I was able to take my knowledge of organic chemistry into the DAT. As for how I studied for the DAT, I ended up taking about 60% of the time I studied to study for the natural science portions of the exam compared to the other sections. Although I did my best to adhere to the 10-week calendar that DAT Bootcamp provided at the beginning, I ended up being about 3 weeks behind the study schedule that they suggested. However, I was able to create a calendar that was better for me to study for the natural sciences, and I was able to complete all of the sections on the DAT Bootcamp course for biology, organic chemistry, and general chemistry. The biology section was pretty straightforward in terms of how I studied, except that I was really behind. What DAT Bootcamp has you do is they have you take a chapter of biology and watch all of the videos in one day, and then you go over the next day and review all of the notes and materials as you're like taking the practice, as you're doing the practice questions and eventually taking the practice tests. Supposedly, you're supposed to be able to finish this over about 30 to 40 days with the schedule, but I ended up finishing the biology review 2 days before the exam. Although I would not recommend this, this is what I had to do to be able to take the DAT. 2 days before the DAT, I learned 3 of the last chapters that were on the biology portion of the exam. That was all I had left at that point, so what I did is I took the videos that were left for those 3 chapters and watched them and answered the questions alongside them, and then the next day I reviewed them for a good amount of time, and then I reviewed all of the biology content for the exam. The day before the exam was pretty hectic because it had been advised that you were supposed to rest that day, maybe do a light review, but I ended up studying about 12 hours of biology and reviewing everything from the beginning to the end that I had learned that summer. This was actually what was best for me because I didn't really remember what I had studied in May concerning the biology section, so to be able to review it the day before the exam actually gave me a clearer picture of what I needed to remember when I was taking the DAT. However, as crazy as that sounds, about 10 days before the DAT, I did take the full day off and not do anything concerning studying. I just rested, I spent time with friends, I was spending time growing in my faith, be able to fuel myself so that I could study to the best of my abilities. Because of that, although I was testing with an average of a 19 for the biology section before taking the DAT, my actual score ended up being a 22. I was actually genuinely surprised about this because I had heard that the questions on the DAT Bootcamp site were a little harder than the ones that were found on the actual DAT. I remember there being a question concerning physiology on the actual DAT that I had had word for word in DAT Bootcamp. Similarly to that question, there were a few others that I had also seen pretty much the same on DAT Bootcamp when I was taking my actual exam, and that was actually really encouraging for me as I realized that DAT Bootcamp had adequately prepared me for the biology section of the exam. Despite biology probably being the most difficult section for me to learn in DAT Bootcamp, it was not my lowest score in the actual DAT. And I found that DAT Bootcamp was successful in preparing me after having learned a lot of my biology over the pandemic, as well as just not remembering most of what I had learned in undergrad concerning the topic. I found that Dr. Mike's videos were so helpful on the topic. Because I hadn't done super well in general chemistry in undergrad, I was actually really scared to take this portion of the DAT and was a little apprehensive when using DAT Bootcamp. However, the reason that Dr. Mike's videos were so helpful is because I'm a visual learner and it helped me put into perspective the questions and the topics that I was learning in general chemistry. Alongside biology, I was actually pretty behind on the general chemistry portion of the exam, and I ended up finishing content review about 2.5 weeks before my DAT. As I was working through content review, I was scoring about an average of a 20 on the general chemistry portion of the exam. However, when I was taking my DAT, I ended up scoring a 24. In all honesty, I don't remember how the questions on the DAT for general chemistry compared to the ones that I had in DAT Bootcamp, but considering that my score was 4 points higher than my average for my review testing, I think it's fair to say that the questions were either a little bit easier on the DAT or that by that point I had just remembered all of what I had learned and was able to do successfully on my actual exam. As for the organic chemistry section, I found that Dr. Mike's videos were also super helpful. In college, I had done pretty well in organic chemistry compared to general chemistry, so I was a little bit surprised when I had some difficulty learning the organic chemistry section for the DAT. Dr. Mike's videos were really helpful visuals for me to intake as I was studying and reviewing for the DAT, which ended up being a good thing because I actually struggled a lot more with the organic chemistry section than I thought I would. I found that I was actually scoring higher on the general chemistry section compared to organic chemistry, which was strange considering that my grades were the reverse in college. Because of this, I ended up signing up for 2 of DAT Bootcamp's crash courses, and while they were slightly helpful, I don't think they were worth the money. After doing these crash courses, I just did my best and studied as hard as I could for the organic chemistry section. I ran through all of the practice videos, ran through as many practice questions as possible, and I ended up finishing the organic chemistry review about 2 weeks before my actual DAT. During my review, I was scoring an average of a 17, but on my actual DAT, I scored a 21 on the organic chemistry section. Overall, before the DAT, I was averaging about a 19 to 20 for my total science score, but on the actual DAT, I ended up with a 22. Although I was unable to adhere to the traditional 10-week calendar, I think that this is evidence that you can kind of figure out what works best for you and study as you go and still achieve a high score. I do tend to learn best whenever I'm adhering to a strict set of rules, but it was kind of impossible for this amount of time just because I had gotten so behind in the earlier weeks of studying. Because I am a very detailed learner, I was spending a lot more time than I probably should have at the beginning of my studying, which ended up making me behind later in my study sessions. However, I still was able to perform better than I thought I would, and I was really happy with my 22 on the DAT. Next, the PAT. Despite the difficulty of the PAT, this ended up being one of my two favorite sections. Throughout college, I had heard that this section was notoriously difficult, so I actually downloaded an app in 2021 that allowed me to practice PAT questions on the go so that I could get a better feel of this part of the exam. Unfortunately, this app is no longer in the App Store, and I ended up deleting it pretty quickly into studying for my DAT, as it was not fully representative of the questions by that point. However, I do know that there are other apps available to practice the PAT questions, as well as there are additional resources found in each of the study courses such as DAT Bootcamp and others that can help you practice for the PAT. When I was first following the 10-week bootcamp plan, they had it set up where you would learn a section of the PAT and then do practice questions following it. Over time, you would accumulate the types of questions that you had learned because there were a total of 6, and then you would eventually be able to practice all of them in one go. I ended up modifying this a little bit, and what I did is after I'd learned all of the types of questions, I would take 60 minutes a day and try to practice all of the types of questions for the PAT. I would try to do the 90 questions that are represented on the actual exam, with a little grace period in between since I had to switch between question banks as I was trying not to use up all of my full-length PAT practice tests, but I ended up not doing this every day like I had planned. I probably studied for the PAT about 4 to 5 times a week despite wanting to study for it every single day. I would switch between the question banks and the PAT generators, and then eventually I practiced with the full-length tests. I only ended up taking 7 out of 10 of the full-length practice tests available for the PAT on DAT Bootcamp. So while I was averaging a 21 on the PAT section in DAT Bootcamp, I ended up receiving a total score of a 26. I found that on the actual exam, they were not nearly as difficult as the ones that I had been practicing with DAT Bootcamp. The way I'd been studying for my PAT versus the way I took the actual PAT on my exam were completely different. While I was studying for the PAT, I found that I was actually running out of time toward the end of the 60 minutes, and I would have to rush the last 15 questions in about 7 minutes. This is because I had been spending way too much time on the first 15 questions of the PAT, which ended up putting me behind later in the questions. However, during my actual DAT, I had 3 minutes left on the clock, and I was able to review questions that I had tagged along the way. I was pretty surprised that I had this option since I hadn't been able to do that while reviewing, but I ended up doing pretty well and was really happy with my score. I do want to encourage all of you to not give up on the PAT if you think you're doing poorly. I honestly didn't think I was doing super well in the review, and I ended up scoring 5 points higher on the actual DAT than I had been in my practice tests. So please keep going, don't give up on the PAT. This is just a hurdle you have to get over to be able to go to dental school. And as you keep studying, I know you're gonna do amazing as you keep practicing for the PAT. Next up, reading comprehension. To my surprise, this was actually my best score on the DAT. While a lot of people tend to do the best in the reading comprehension section of the DAT, I was actually expecting to do pretty poorly considering how I had done on the ACT and the SAT in high school for my reading sections. DAT Bootcamp encourages that you try multiple study methods when conquering the reading comprehension section. Some of the methods I tried were the search and destroy method, the vanilla method, and the BYU 4U method. The search and destroy method is when you don't read the passage and you just read the questions and look for the answers directly by picking them out. The vanilla method is when you spend about 7 to 9 minutes on the passage and then you spend 10 to 12 minutes on the actual questions right after reading it. And the BYU 4U method is when you read the title and the first 2 paragraphs kind of slowly, and then you read to the halfway mark as quick as you can. Then you go back and answer all of those questions to the best of your ability, and then you read the rest of the passage and finish out the questions. I As I was studying and trying all of these methods, I found that I was still only getting 12 to 13 questions out of the 16 to 17 questions per passage correct. Luckily, as I was studying for the DAT, I ran into a friend that I had known in college, and he suggested that I try combining some of the methods to see what suited me best for the reading comprehension section. He suggested that using the highlight tool, I skim the entire passage and highlight what I thought were key words for the passage, and then go back and answer all of the questions with those highlights in mind. This method actually worked best for me since I am a visual learner because I was able to remember the words that I had highlighted as I was answering the questions. Admittedly, this study method was a time gamble for me because while I was supposed to be spending about 20 minutes on each passage, I would end up spending about 25 on the first passage, leaving me 35 minutes for the remaining 2. Surprisingly, while I was averaging a 21 on DAT Bootcamp, I ended up scoring a 27 on the actual DAT. Personally, I felt that the actual exam questions were a lot easier than the ones I had been practicing with. On the first passage that I had in the exam, rather than there being 15 traditional paragraphs, there ended up being 22 paragraphs to encompass the 1,500 words that were supposed to be in that first portion. This passage ended up being a lot easier because it was more definition-based than the ones I'd been practicing in DAT Bootcamp, and I ended up finishing it a lot quicker and was able to review all 3 passages at the end of my DAT, whereas when I was studying with DAT Bootcamp, I was not able to review the tagged questions. I had to switch which type of passage method I used multiple times throughout studying, and then ended up finding one that worked best for me in the end. I would encourage that you try each study method that you find at least twice when reading a passage so that you can see which one works best for you when studying for the DAT. For me, I ended up having to study my reading comprehension method midway through studying for my DAT, but it ended up working out for the best for me, and I was able to score the highest score I did on all of the sections. Going into the DAT, I thought that the math section was going to be one of my best sections considering how I had done on the ACT and the SAT on my math section compared to my reading section. However, this ended up not being as true as I thought it would be. Prior to the DAT, I was scoring a 19 on average for my practice tests. However, because of time constraint, I just worked my best to knock out this section as quick as possible. My method of studying for quantitative reasoning was picking out the topics that I didn't know as well and going through the videos for them. For example, with algebra, quantitative comparison, and word problems, I would just go and answer the questions that were available after the videos and see if I knew them. And if I didn't know them super well, then I would go back and watch the video so that I could properly answer the question in the future. But there were 2 sections that I was less familiar with that the study method did not work as well in. These sections were statistics and probability and data sufficiency. For statistics and probability, I had to spend more time on these sections because I had taken statistics over Zoom during the pandemic, and I was also taking organic chemistry too during this course, so I had less time to be able to focus on it. For this, the DAT Bootcamp videos actually really helped me in this study process and reminded me of what I had forgotten when I was taking statistics. However, the data sufficiency questions were not the same. These questions actually gave me a ton of grief. I ended up having to call a friend who had majored in math in college, and they graciously explained to me how to answer these questions. Before my friend helped me, I was only getting about 33% of these questions correct, but after they had sat down and explained to me how to answer the questions, what each of the answer choices meant, and how to better visualize the problem in the future, I was able to score about 70% of them correct. Although I wasn't getting them perfectly, it was the best I could do, and I realized that I had to move on from there. So while I was averaging a 19 on DAT Bootcamp, I ended up scoring a 22 on the quantitative reasoning section in my actual DAT. This section was more difficult for me than I had anticipated, but alongside the PAT, it was a section that I really enjoyed because I genuinely just love learning math and I love doing math problems. Because it wasn't as difficult of a topic on my brain, I used math as kind of a study break in between my science sections and my reading comprehension sections so that I would better be able to not burn out while studying for my DAT. Before I took my actual DAT, I was pretty discouraged because I was not scoring as high as I wanted to on my practice exams. My GPA in college was pretty average, so I knew I had to score high on my DAT to be considered in the dental applicant pool. With this in mind, my goal was to get a 22 academic average on the DAT. However, as I was studying, I found that I was averaging a 19 to 20 when I was taking practice exams. Despite not scoring as well as I wanted to, in order to preserve my mental health and to be able to spend time doing the things I love, I did not follow a traditional schedule while studying for my DAT. This did leave me time to spend time with my friends, to grow in my faith, to get enough sleep at night, and to just be a more well-rounded individual so that I could do the best on my DAT without completely burning out. After all of that, I was extremely happy to receive a 23 on my DAT. One of my biggest recommendations is to do what is best for you. Even if you don't follow the traditional study schedules that are available online, it may not be what's best for you to succeed on the exam. While some people need a more strict schedule, some people need to just go with the flow and to do what's best for them for the day rather than push themselves into burnout. I'm living proof that you don't have to get the best scores ever on your reviews to do successful on the actual DAT. The DAT is a really hard exam to get through, but it is just one hurdle to getting into dental school and becoming a dentist. My encouragement to you is to spend time with friends, to take rest when you need it, to get 8 hours of sleep a night, to grow in your faith if you want to, and to just do everything you can to take care of yourself first while also studying for your DAT. With all of this in mind, I know that you are going to do amazing on your DAT, and I wish you the best of luck in your study process. Thanks for tuning into Day-to-Day Dental with Daisha. If you think that this video would help a pre-dental student, then send it their way. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. And until next time, have an amazing day!